So without further ado, I'd like to invite Nancy and the esteemed panelists to come on the stage, and she will introduce the panelists as they come on board. Thank you, Nancy. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists and kick things off for the morning. First, we have Cathy Contreras. She's the Acquisition Executive for the Defense Logistics Agency Aviation, so DLA Aviation. She assumed this position in January of 2017, so just relatively recently. She has experience serving a wide variety of positions within DoD and DLA. Her previous assignments include Director of Strategic Acquisition Programs for DLA and the Chief Information Technology and Telecommunications for the Defense Contracting Command at the Pentagon. So thank you and welcome, Cathy. Next, I have the honor of introducing a colleague of mine, Soraya Correa. She's been appointed as the Department of Homeland Security's Chief Procurement Officer since January of 2015. She provides leadership to the department and its variety of component agencies and supporting a contracting workforce of approximately 1,500 individuals, including those 9 operational contracting activities. So I'm very familiar with DHS and her role during my time at FEMA. She had also served as the head of contracting activity for the DHS components and has a wide and varied acquisition career. And then finally, I get to introduce Jim Baddley. He is currently a professor at DAU, teaching Con 170, Con 270, and Con 90. Those are the DAU's premier contract pricing courses. So he's very appropriate for this panel. He's spent 32 years as a cost price analyst for the Air Force at Hill Air Force Base in Utah. His last 6 years were spent working on contracts for classified programs, including multi-billion-dollar source selection. So hopefully he can tell us a little bit about what that was like. Anyway, so welcome, my panelists. I've asked each of them to give a little bit of discussion, providing some background information about their organizations and what their focus areas are, and in particular, some of the challenges that they're currently facing in government contract pricing, and some of the ideas and initiatives that they have strategically and tactically underway to resolve those challenges. So Cathy, would you like to go first?
Sure, thank you. So as Nancy mentioned, I work for Defense Logistics Agency, and Defense Logistics Agency is responsible for providing support globally to all of the military services across a wide variety of different areas, medical, food, as well as aviation and land and maritime sustainment, which is where my responsibility is. I'm the acquisition executive for aviation sustainment, and within that particular supply chain, we're responsible for spending about $4 billion a year with the aviation industry. About half of that, to give you some perspective of kind of how our pricing process works, about half of that is actually with our sole source original equipment manufacturers of those aviation platforms. And then there are about 16 of those original equipment manufacturers that represent half of that spend. The other half is spread across about 4,000 different suppliers, and that's primarily competitive spend. So a lot of that other spend is in the competitive marketplace. So we deal a lot with both sole source as well as competitive pricing, and we also have a good amount of pricing in both the commercial and the military unique area. So I would say that one of the biggest challenges that we've had of late is really the aging of the weapon system platforms that we're supporting. If you take the B-52, for example, that's a platform that was fielded in the 1940s, early 1950s, was recently extended to 2040. So there are a lot of parts on that particular aircraft that we never anticipated needing to buy or have not bought in an extremely long period of time. So trying to determine the pricing for those items, the basis for that pricing, can be difficult both from a government perspective as well as from a supplier perspective in an environment where we're really seeking to look for perfection in pricing. So the proposal turnaround times, both from the time for us to get the proposal as well as the time to have the proposal evaluated, tend to become very lengthened. So one of the things that we've been trying to do, and Mr. Assad mentioned this morning when he was speaking, one of the things that we've been trying to do is really increase the collaborative nature of our relationships with some of our big sole source suppliers to address that concern. We have put FPI or FPI-like contracts in place with a couple of our major suppliers and are striving to do more of that to really increase the transparency of our insight into their pricing and to reduce the risk. So through being able to share that risk and profitability, we've been able to set relatively low base profit levels, but then what we've been able to do is really incentivize those suppliers to drive those supply chains, to really manage those supply chains, to reduce the costs to us overall and really increase their profitability, and have done that fairly successfully. So that's one of the things that we've been able to do to really address the big concern that we're having with obsolescence and aging weapon system platforms.
That's great. Soraya, how about you?
Right. Well, thank you. And Nancy, thank you for having me here today, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. At the Department of Homeland Security, we process about $17 billion annually in procurements, and we buy a little bit of everything. You name it, we buy it, whether it's technology, whether it's ocean-going craft, whether it's aircraft, security equipment, we buy everything. So the way I like to characterize it is we're in the business of protecting the homeland. It is about the people who live and visit our country, making sure that they're secure and safe, and it is all about the mission. And I would say that the largest challenge that we face is similar to what you're saying, getting that speed, the speed at which we can move in the procurement environment to get technology in, to get products and services in, and in the hand of those first responders. That, to me, is the biggest challenge. When I took this job, having served as a head of contracting twice before serving various mission spaces, I recognized the importance of moving our procurement process a little bit better and making sure that we remove the obstacles, the things that slow us down, and the things that stop us from moving forward. So one of the things that we did when I first started, we did a survey of people and asked, why aren't you more innovative and creative in contracting? What stops you from taking chances and perhaps taking some of the risks that we should be taking when we're trying to support a mission like the Department of Homeland Security? And 70% of the respondents came back and said fear. Fear of the protest, fear of not getting the answer right. So one of the things that I've focused on is trying to remove that fear. And to that end, I stood up what's called the Procurement Innovation Lab, where I really invite contracting officers, program managers, and any member of the team to bring us their ideas on how we can improve our evaluation processes, our business processes for how we review our procurements, or even how we price procurements. Bring me your idea. Let's put it in a test case, be it a procurement that you're working on or a procurement that another organization is working on, and let's monitor and see if we can implement that innovative approach and what happens when we implement that innovative approach. And here's the deal, and this is where leadership comes in. If it's successful, they own that procurement. If it's not successful, I own it, and I'll use an example of that a little later because I have one. But the point is, leadership has to step up and say, I want you to be innovative, I want you to be creative, then we got to create that safe space for employees. And we have to enable them, we have to empower them, and we have to reward them even if they fail in that innovation. Because if not, we're not going to get creativity and we're going to keep doing things the same way over and over again. The other thing that I've done is incentivized our folks to get that conversation going with industry as early as possible in the process. I don't like to use the term market research because that's picked up a dull meaning. I'm talking about planning. I'm talking about early on when you first identify the problem set that you're trying to solve or what you think you're going to buy. Let's get out there and talk to industry before we even have a solicitation. Let's go learn about that industry. You heard Shay said you have to understand what you're buying. You have to understand how it's priced. How about we get out there and understand that industry and understand how they sell to one another, because they do, and how they sell to other federal agencies. And get that information as upfront and as early as possible so that you're incorporating that learning as you go in the process. To that end, we've stood up what I call Acquisition Innovations in Motion, AIM, which is intended to be ways that we can improve working with industry, how we communicate with industry, how we gather information from industry, and then how we train our people on that information, how we bring that back into our training. So AIM has been hugely successful. We have over 170 industry engagements on average across the department per year. A lot of them, we call them learning events, where we're actually just talking to industry. No solicitation, no particular requirement. We're just really trying to understand each other. I host two major events. One's called Reverse Industry Day, where for a change we have industry sit up here talking to the government folks, our acquisition team, which includes the program manager, the cost estimator, and the procurement folks, helping us understand what they think about, what motivates them to compete, what drives them when they're putting together their pricing, what kind of information they need from us, and what works and what doesn't work. The second one, we call it the Strategic Industry Conversation. And that's where I bring in our senior leaders from the department to talk about the problems that we confront, the issues that we're trying to solve, and where we see our department going over the next 3 to 5 years. Very powerful event, usually about 600 people attend, and they're hearing from senior leadership, and it's an opportunity to really have some candid exchanges about some of the issues that we confront. The last thing I'll mention is strategic sourcing. We have been and continue to be a huge advocate of strategic sourcing in the department. We started our program literally like right after the department was stood up in 2003, early 2004. Today we have over 80 contracts in our portfolio of strategic sourcing. We generate probably about $400 million a year in savings. And we continue to add to that portfolio of strategic sourcing. But we've taken strategic sourcing to a different level. Strategic sourcing to us is 2 or more organizations having a need. It's not about the entire department or the entire federal government. It's about 2 or more. The other thing that we've also done is taken that to the mission space. We started out with the standard commodity buys to buy IT services and IT hardware, yada, yada, yada. Now we're focusing on mission space. What do we need to solve missions, whether it's buying guns, ammunition, whatever it is, making sure that we're doing a little bit more strategic sourcing and leveraging our buying power. We're also the category manager for all things security, which is really exciting from a department standpoint. So those are some of the things that we're doing to address the issues we confront. But at Department of Homeland Security, what happens is our issues change on a daily basis. The threat is always changing.
Thank you. And Jim, can you tell us a little bit about DAU and your time at Hill Air Force Base?
Yeah, so well, that's a little loud. So I'll revert back to the Air Force stuff and take it more on like a personal level. 6 months ago, I was you. 10 years ago, I was you. 20 years ago, I was you. I was a price analyst for all these years, and some of the things that we ran into lately before I left, we were doing mostly services, but we had a lot of cost contracts. Big dollars, lots of years. There were 8 to 15 years, and we were running into problems where the contractors were really trying to game the realism aspect of it. So I guess it's more an innovation of thought. It's how can we better write what we want from a pricing standpoint to see from in their cost volumes so that Shay alluded to us wasting a lot of time, so that we actually don't have to spend effort on things that you go through the whole EN process and go through iteration of these things just to get back to where you could have been in the first place. An example of that would be escalation. We're doing a service contract in an area where everybody's going to be using the same employees. In our classified area, it was literally going to be not the same type of employees, but the same employees. So we'd say, all right, they're going to be these employees. We don't want games with escalation. I don't know when you're pricing your sole source stuff, but I've never seen negative escalation proposed by contractors. I don't see flat line escalation proposed by contractors. So what we would do is we would go out and say, all right, we're going to dictate in the solicitation what they should propose. This is going to be used for evaluation purposes. They would propose a set escalation rate. And they all seemed to be really good with it because they knew that the other guy wasn't getting something over on them by doing some other type of shenanigans to where they're coming in even lower. So we had buy-off from industry that, from a protest standpoint, no issues on that. Even to some aspects, we would go into direct labor rates if, in fact, it was going to be the same people. At that base level, we would provide, this is what it is. We're not telling you types and quantities, but if you're using this category, this is the rate you should use because we know they're going to rebadge the guys. This is what it's going to be. And that saved us. We learned the hard way. We didn't do it. And then we saw the negative escalation, and we saw the zero escalation. And so we learned the hard way, but we got to the point where we started writing our solicitations as far as requiring the data that we would mandate this is what you use. And then instead of this big analysis process for those particular elements, it was a fairly quick, simple validation process. Have you complied with Section L and M, started the escalation on the right date, and used the right numbers? And so, I mean, that really helped us overcome a lot of issues we were having with the whole realism, gamesmanship for certain cost elements.
Great, thank you. So I have a question prepared for each of the panelists, and we do invite you to fill out your note cards and bring your questions forward, but I'll go ahead and tee a few up to get things started as you think about your own questions. So Cathy, you talked a little bit about your supply chain challenges in terms of the platform and the aging of them, so you must have some pretty significant obsolescence issues and that impact you day to day. What kind of things do you do to determine prices are fair and reasonable in dealing in that obsolescence area?
Yes, that's a good question. So one of the big challenges we have with obsolescence is really the lack of competition, because you don't have competition to base the fair and reasonable prices on, and you don't also have a good baseline for which to use. So there are a number of different techniques that we've employed internally to really deal with that. I would say one of the big efforts that we've had is we put a contract in place that's multiple awards to several different suppliers, or we can take parts where we have concerns over pricing obsolescence issues, and we basically compete the reverse engineering of parts, for example, amongst those suppliers to come up with a technical data package that then we can take and go out and look for competition for those particular parts and develop sources. We can also use that same type of information to develop should-cost analysis that then we can use to determine the price is fair and reasonable. But it is a challenge that we do face on a regular basis. But those are two of the big things that we really do to address that.
And how long is that process?
So it depends. I mean, if the supplier, sometimes at first we'll go to the suppliers and ask if there's some basis of comparison that they can make. Is there something else that they do in the commercial marketplace that may be a new technology that's very similar to what we're asking for that we can get the information on? That tends to be a quicker turnaround kind of a thing. If we need to go out and actually develop new sources or do a full should-cost analysis, we could be talking about anything from 60 days to 6 months or more, really, to get that information. So it definitely does drive time and causes some impacts, from a warfighter support perspective.
Thank you. Soraya, you brought up the reverse industry days, and I've heard great things about those, and there's a push from industry, I think, across the board for more departments to do that. What are the one or two key takeaways you've heard from industry about the things we do in the government that drive their behavior from a pricing perspective?
Sure,
what do we do that drives industry crazy?
Oh, we do a lot of things. No, just kidding. No, I think what we hear most from industry is come to us as early as possible in the process. Give us as much information as you have. We recognize, and this is the real key takeaway, they recognize that things are changing. They recognize that, when we're in the early planning stages, we still haven't even really fully baked our requirements. They get that. But as early as possible in the process, the more information that they have, the better they feel, the more comfortable they are. And what they've explained to us is they go through a process very similar to us when they're justifying their buys. Of course, a small business kind of talks to itself, but a large business has a team of people that they got to justify the investment of those bid and proposal dollars. So the more information that they have, the more knowledge and understanding that they have of the customer, the requirement, and the organization, and how they're going to use that product or service, the better off they're going to be, and the more likely you are to get good, solid competition. They really, generally speaking, are interested in competition. They really value that. But they also feel uncomfortable partaking in a competitive process when they feel the information hasn't been out there. So industry really pushes very hard for getting information as early as possible for sections B, C, L, and M of the solicitation. When when you talk about sending out a draft statement of work, industry will say, thank you very much, but can I have the other pieces? I really need to know what you're thinking about from a pricing standpoint, and I really need to understand what you're looking for in that proposal and how you're going to evaluate it. So they're very interested in that information. The other thing that they do share with us is that often the government jumps into a pricing scheme without really understanding how industry prices. In other words, that we kind of come at it with, this is how we want the price structured, without thinking through how would industry really price that. So one of the things that has come out that I think is really good is having those conversations with industry and really learning how they price things across one another, how they've seen it priced at other solicitations, how do they normally sell things. A lot of the things that we're buying more and more are commercial items or comprised of commercial items. So why would we ask industry to restructure their pricing? Why not just do exactly what Shay said? Understand how they price similar items, and use that to our advantage.
Great, thank you. Jim, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being fluent and 1 being a little or no cost or pricing skill, where would you rate your current organization's contracting professionals on their pricing skills?
Well, Hill was kind of a unique atmosphere because they had a dedicated pricing shop. So because of that, people were able to, I guess, push off their responsibility from a contracting officer standpoint of learning, exactly what I have to do to price this stuff. I think we were doing almost everything above $5 million, which when I go to the DPAP conference and find out there's CEOs doing stuff that's $75 million and can't get anybody to help them, it's like, okay, it's a little different out there. So I would probably say we're closer to a 2 because they've been able to rely on other people to do their work for them. So, that's kind of unique. You may not have that in the other ones. I guess one of the things I've seen since I've now switched over to DAU too that's explained some of this is we're in such a rush, in such a hurry to get these people their certifications. You've got to be level 1, you've got to be level 2, that when they're actually getting some of this training is way in advance of when they would actually use it. So if there's some sort of refresher programs, I think that, someone could go out and even teach them, okay, yeah, you remember back when you came in, because I'm in a class right now, and it's a level 2 class that I'm teaching, and probably half the class has less than 1 year experience. They're not doing the type of buys where they need this, and when they need it, it's going to be down the road. And so if they could somehow get some refresher training even on here's how you use the tools, here's what they'll do for you, here's what it'll provide, these are the important things to go after when you're breaking down a proposal, and just some of that information there, I think you could get that level from a 2 up to a 3 or 4, even if they still had the pricing group to rely on there, because they would be forced to say, oh yeah, I need to remember that. I am doing these things, and it would make more sense now that they have buys that have those situations in them.
So I'll add a little bit to that. So we've had kind of a similar type of an experience. From an DLA aviation perspective, we have 6 different contracting sites, and they've all, several of them were at one time aligned with the military services, so they all operated a little bit differently and had some of the, the different interpretations of how things should be, and we've kind of combined all those into one culture. But one of the things that we've seen is that we kind of went through this whole pendulum swinging where we sent an awful lot of the pricing work out to DCAA and DCMA to do that pricing support for us. And I think we lost some of that pricing expertise that we had internally. And so right now we're really going through a process to try to regrow that internal pricing capability that we have. We are trying to do more and more from a DLA perspective, more and more pricing internally, and going back out and training our folks again on, hey, some of this stuff, we really have the capability and the information to be able to make some of these pricing decisions, and it really is about how do we understand the contractor and their pricing support and the way that they are structured. We've assigned specific pricers within the organizations to face certain suppliers, really to have that level of understanding of them, similar to how DCAA and DCMA operate. And so that's really the direction that we've been trying to go from a DLA perspective, is trying to really get more of that internal pricing capability back, in-house, and developing our folks to do that.
Yeah, I was going to chime in on that as well, because you raise a really valid point. We go out and we train folks even before they've even applied what they've learned. So sometimes we're trying to teach very advanced techniques to very junior personnel or people that are in their first stages of acquisition training, so they haven't had the opportunity to experience. So one of the things that we started doing is we do just-in-time webinars or very short fuse training that you can take right at your desktop. We started doing this about 2.5 years ago, and it's been very popular, where we have a trainer more like a facilitator of a discussion between the contracting community on a webinar, and they go through live exercises, or we're teaching them or refreshing them on what they need to know for a specific instance. It's been very popular because it's usually 2-4 hours or maybe a day at most. You can do it from your desktop. You can participate. An example of one, because I came in, this was my pet peeve, negotiations. I think we get away from negotiations. We call it discussions.
Right.
And we ask a lot of questions, but we're not really negotiating. I like to haggle, Let's haggle over that price. So what we've done is we've had some simulated training sessions, and people have come back and said, that was great, where they have an opportunity half a day to be the government and then the other half of the day to be the contractor. But they're doing that now, after they've been through the training. I mean, I think the training is great that we provide. The problem is if you don't put it into practice right away, you're going to forget those skills. So by having these webinars available and continually showing these things, people are coming back up to speed. The other thing that I'll say, I think it's great to have a team of pricing experts. I do. They're sitting over there. I have a nice team of pricing experts there to support. But I still think it is important to put it on the contracting officer that ultimately you are responsible. You are responsible for that price negotiation, how you lead that team, and the kind of information that you infuse and get from that team to make your decisions. The pricing team is really there to support you, to help you learn new concepts, understand things, but you can't depend on them. And I think that's a very important takeaway that we've gotten over the last few years. You're right, you get too far away from it, it becomes somebody else's problem.
And that's where critical thinking skills come into play too, to bring that all together and ask those right questions.
Own it.
Exactly. Can you give us the examples you mentioned you might have in terms of your innovation successes and failures?
Sure. So in the Innovation Lab, like I said, we invite people in with their ideas, their concepts of how we could speed up evaluations. So one of the examples of successes is we started on a test and evaluation procurement. Instead of having the contractor write, reams of paper about how they do their processes and how they manage their testing and how great and wonderful they are, how about you come in and show us? So what we literally did was the team put together code that had errors in it. And then each contractor came in with their team of people, their team of experts. They were given an hour to analyze that code. And then they came into a room where we had all our evaluators present, and they answered a series of questions. It was basically a test. It was a presentation, almost like a job interview. And then when the contractor went away, that afternoon, the evaluation team would sit down and do their consensus evaluation. We got rid of that individual evaluator thing. We did a consensus evaluation, rated the proposal, and moved on to the next one. The evaluators loved it because they were in and out of the room. I think it was in like about 2-3 weeks' time, and they actually talked to 10 different contractors. The contractors loved it because they didn't have to go through the massive writing exercise. They had an opportunity to come in and talk to the government, present their skills, and present whatever was unique about their solution and approach. We were able to get that evaluation completed, like I said, in about 2 to 3 weeks' time. And the response from the program manager was, I believe we got better qualified companies because of that, because we really understood what they could do. We understood the kind of people they were bringing to the table and what those people really knew and understood. I'm going to talk about one that failed recently. You've probably read about it. It's called Flash. We were doing agile software development. And the way I characterize Flash is we took a very innovative approach to our evaluation, our solicitation and our evaluation process. Where we fell down and where our failure came in was that our approach was not as innovative when it came to the documentation piece of this. And so we created documentation in response to the evaluation that was pretty much similar to what we had done before. And in doing that, we made some missteps. Some errors were judgment errors, where we made some errors in judgment. Some were that we really didn't rely on the expertise that we have available to do certain parts of the evaluation. We didn't rely on our pricing experts the way we should have. The technical experts did a really good job. And in the end, we made a decision, I made the decision, that after 2 rounds of protests, we weren't going to take corrective action, because the corrective action that most people want you to take is go ahead and award to the protesters. I refuse to do that. I refuse to succumb to that. I think that's just giving in. I would rather walk away from the solicitation and take the bruising that may give me than to award to companies that may not really meet the standard. So that was one of our failures. Now, here's what I'll tell you about that failure. We learned a lot in that evaluation. In fact, we're going through our lessons learned report, and Chip Fulgham, who's our acting Undersecretary for Management, and myself are actually going to be hosting a few events to talk about what we learned from that solicitation. I was very honored, unfortunately I wasn't able to be present, to present an award to the team, an Acquisition Excellence Award, to the team that worked on Flash, because the team really did innovate. And when you innovate, you are going to make mistakes. There will be failures, and leadership has to stand up, accept that, respect that, and reward it. And so that's the concept behind my Procurement Innovation Lab is let's bring people in and let them think independently, come up with bright ideas, and let's see how we can get through this process faster, more efficiently, and get better solutions.
That's great. Cathy, you touched a little bit upon it already, but do you experience challenges in commercial pricing environment? Shay touched upon
we do. And I think one of the big challenges that we've had, and it really links back to the whole obsolescence type of an issue, is that, I'll give an example. So we bought an engine platform. We, being the Department of Defense, bought an engine platform a number of years ago. When we bought that platform, it was fully a commercial engine flown on, commercial aircraft around the world. And so the pricing structure for that was definitely commercial off the shelf. We would basically base our prices on commercial sales and make sure we got the best discounts kind of an approach. Well, over the years, that engine has gone through several upgrades and iterations of the models of the engine. Well, from a Department of Defense perspective, we've made the decision not to necessarily evolve our engines at the same rate. So now we are supporting an engine platform that's significant generations behind what's being flown commercially. So determining those prices fair and reasonable, although they're all catalog prices and there still are some sales in the commercial marketplace, they're not many, and clearly the government has the preponderance of the sales across that particular version of the engine. So it gets tricky, right, to try to make sure two things. One is, how do we make sure that we're getting a fair and reasonable price, for those parts themselves? And sometimes that requires a lot of technical data and information where we're going and saying, okay, what is the part that performs this same function on the newer version of the engine? And what does that part cost? And is there a reason that part cost is different than this part cost due to the volume of sales you have for the part or things like that? So I think that's one aspect of it that we work very closely actually with the DCMA Commercial Pricing Center of Excellence. They've been involved with us very closely on that with that whole platform. And then the other area is, how do we make sure that we are getting the best discount? Because our volume of business, while it may be similar, the way we buy the material is very different. So we actually recently went through an exercise, and Shay Assad's office participated with us in this, where we worked with the supplier to go back through and identify how they provide their discount structure, because it's very different commercially than what it is for us. They do, back-end discounts and seasonal discounts, and so how do you look at common customers who are similar in size and scope, maybe buy a little bit of different market, but similar things, and to make sure that we were getting the best overall discount on the body of work we were buying. So it's definitely a struggle when we bought something clearly commercial, but we've not kept up with technology.
Great, thank you. So again, we invite you to send your questions forward. I think, Al, you have collectors who are going to help bring those forward. Meanwhile, I'll continue with some questions. Soraya, what are the challenges your team faces in terms of cost realism analysis? I know within my own component command, we have challenges, and the question of LPTA got brought up earlier in terms of services. In a cost-type environment, what are the challenges you are facing in terms of determining rate reasonableness on a lot of these services-type procurements?
So one of the things that I'll say is that we create some of our own challenges. And I have to say that very honestly, that a lot of the services that we're buying are not unlike what industry sells and buys commercially. But sometimes we put ourselves in the box because we want to specify certain qualifications, criteria that isn't consistent with what's out there. So one of the things that we're trying to do is bring people back to that norm, to say, you're not buying something that substantially different. Let's talk about whether or not you really need to be going into cost realism. Because Shay raised a very good point, and that is most of what is out there isn't that unique, and you just have to understand it. You have to understand what's similar so that you can do those comparative analysis. I think we spend a lot of time doing a lot of cost realism analysis where sometimes it doesn't really fit. We do a lot of work in the research and development area, obviously at DHS, because we are trying to get to those new technologies, those new solutions, and those new approaches to doing business. And that's the area where we spend a lot of time in the cost analysis part. And what I would say is the challenges are that we don't teach that very well, and we don't practice it that much, because a lot of the folks that we're bringing into the workforce, they're buzzing through their training to get their certification. but they don't really apply. There's not a lot of us that do cost contracting. Hire folks from the commercial side of the house, unless they work like places like DOE or NASA or maybe even DHS, or they come from DOD. They're really not doing a lot in the cost area. So there's not a lot of experience out there, and I think that's where the weakness is. And I think that's where the big challenge is how do we get that back into the training so people understand it.
And Jim, what do you see changing in the training environment?
Well, I mean, real quick on her point, I think one thing that I've seen in realism is you're looking at it from a completely different aspect. You know, we've been historically taught on firm fixed price, prices can be unreasonably high, and on cost ones they can be unrealistically low. And so they've got to flip that mindset, saying, okay, I've got to look at this rate now. Is this rate, unless they have a forward pricing rate agreement, and even then they get creative. They'll be, well, we're going to win this multi-billion-dollar contract, and we're going to win this other one, and it's going to have this impact on our rates. And you got to be able to play the BS card on it and say, no, if you win this one, it'll have this impact, but if this other one, you're not going to have, and so you've got to pull that stuff out. And so we're pushing prices down in sole source, and in realism, we're pushing prices up. And for some people, that's a really hard concept to get their arms around. So that's some of the, I guess, challenges I've seen with folks is they're like, oh, that's a good deal. No, it's a cost contract. You're going to pay what it costs. That may be a good deal, that may not. Let's do the analysis and see if actually it is. So that's, I guess, further on that point, the thing I've seen with realism from our aspect. And then you asked about the training?
The current training. What do you see changing in terms of the way DAU is approaching training and cost?
I think the training, like I said, the DAU has is good. I would say if I had to change something would be to say, all right, after a certain number of years, you're required to take either a 4 or 6 hour course again just to refresh what you were given before it was even actually applicable. The training, I think, is very good training. I've learned some things from it. I mean, the frustrating part is, again, because I've been doing this stuff for so long, when I used to haul my abacus to negotiations, and Tina was $100,000, if you guys can even imagine that. But so I got level certified years ago through the Air Force Institute of Technology. A couple years ago, I put in for an advanced pricing class, and it's like, oh, let's see what all the new young kids are doing, find out what's new out there. I got shot down. It's like, you're level 3 certified. You do not need this course. I'm thinking, so I don't ever need to be trained or brought up to speed or something like that. So I guess I would make some of the classes available to folks that have already reached certain levels, just to maintain those levels, or come up with some classes down the road, or have, DAU has a thing called mission assistance where they'll come out and, maybe they'll come into your workforce and say, all right, I'm going to give you a quick one-day refresher on all these tools that we gave you during your training. So I think if you could do something to supplement the training a few years after they have reached their level 2, level 3 certifications, it would be very beneficial.
I agree.
If I could add to that, and I also think that we have a responsibility for trying to get people into environments to apply what they learn in the training, to try to give opportunities, whether it's through detailed assignments or just giving them real case studies, having them work on certain projects. So that's one of the things that we've tried to do, that sometimes we're reaching across the department saying, hey, here's an opportunity, and trying to convince each other that sometimes it's worthwhile giving up that resource for 3 months, because they do come back stronger. They do come back having learned something. Oh, and by the way, they might come back and bring you some people because they meet other people and they say, look at what a great place I worked at because I got some training. So if you heard that, anybody want to say? But all kidding aside, one of the things that I've really pushed hard is those detail assignments to say, if we can't provide that opportunity to work on something here, we should try to create those opportunities for our employees, because if not, they're not applying what they're learning in training, and it's all for naught. So.
Well, I think that's where training with industry as well, to really help particularly our pricers and our negotiators understand from an industry perspective what we ask for might be driving, and how there may be a better way to kind of get to the solution, really to increase that collaboration and to work across. So one of the things we've talked about doing is really trying to reinvigorate the whole training with industry and targeting some areas to send people from our organizations into industry to really understand, kind of what impacts we have.
So I'm glad you raised that. Through my Acquisition Innovations in Motion, one of the aspects that we brought was, we call it Acquisition Innovation Roundtables, or AIRs. And what we periodically stand up, we go through industry associations. We don't actually like meet with individual companies. Industry associations will identify representatives that come to the airs. But the airs can be as small as, 10 people, or it could be as high as about maybe 80 people. That's about the most I would ever do. But anyway, on very specific topics. So recently we did a pricing summit where we brought in industry reps and contracting officers and pricing experts from across the department who sat on panels together and talked about innovative pricing strategies and the kinds of things that they're seeing and what they're doing to bring about better pricing solutions. These airs have become very popular. We use them for debriefing, and we learn from industry. It's the opportunity to bring industry in to give you feedback. Again, no solicitation. There's nothing that you're compromising. It's really about learning.
Right.
And industry really appreciates it because it does give them an opportunity to better understand what we're thinking about, what we're looking for from them. So we call them the Acquisition Innovation Roundtables, and they've become very popular as well.
Very helpful. So a question from the audience is, how does your agency view incentive-type contract arrangements, and should there be further guidance for standardization?
So I guess I can talk a little bit about that. So and this kind of gets to encouraging people to do things that are a little outside of their comfort zone. So we were very much in a fixed price type of an environment. We had a major acquisition with one of the big original equipment manufacturers for aviation, and we went to DPAP to talk about what we wanted to do. And we got a really strong push to go fixed price incentive, to really to understand, to really help share that risk, have a little lower base profit level, link profitability to performance a little bit more. And so we, with some encouragement,
let me guess, from Shay.
Yes, yes, from Shay. We actually did that, and I have to say, it has been an extremely successful way to go. The supplier likes it, we like it. We've really seen a lot of effort from the supplier perspective where they've gone out and they've created, even though it's really a sole source procurement, they've gone out with their sub-tier suppliers and created competition where we've driven savings of up to 20% off of what our baseline was going to be, and this is a multi-billion-dollar contract. So it is a big deal over time. So I think our experience has been largely positive. I think there has to be some collaboration in making sure that the assumptions that we're making on both sides are the same, that we're very clear on what the customer desired outcomes are. So when you do link that profitability to performance, the performance you're getting is clearly aligned with what the customer is looking for. But I think from a DLA perspective, our experience has been positive.
Successful.
Yeah.
Very good.
I'm a huge advocate of incentive contracts when appropriate, and as long as you really use the incentive. In other words, what I've seen all too often is we go into these incentive contracts, but then we don't really incentivize the performance. So I think you have to use it, and I think you have to use it both from the positive and the negative, because it is about performance. And incentive contracts, for incentive contracts to really work, you have to have a really good what I would say, regular and recurring conversations going on with the contractor. Transparency, exactly. There can't be any surprises, because if not, you're going to disincentivize the contractor and even your own team. So I'm a huge advocate of incentive contracts. Like Cathy, this push towards firm fixed price contracting, which I think started like about 10 years ago, which has really been driven outside of our agencies, but has kind of taken our agencies forward. Here's what I always tell folks. FAR Part 16 has a lot of different contract types. Let's pick the right one for the job at hand, and don't worry about if somebody doesn't like it up here. You come in and present your case, and let's talk about that particular requirement and that particular case for that contract type.
Very good. And Jim, what was your experience with
I mean, the natural progression is you start at cost plus fixed fee, and then you get a little more knowledge, you get to cost plus incentive fee, then you get to the fixed price incentive, and then you get to finally firm fixed price. And that's kind of the theory of how it's supposed to work. I found it's been very effective. You get to the firm fixed price, and people get set in their positions, and there's these big differences. Again, teaching, I've seen people come through the class. There's a gentleman from Boeing, and he was one that was actually farther along. He was working with Boeing, but he had multi-$100 million plus contracts, and they'd gone back and looked, and they had never, I think, actually earned under 30-something% profit. And I'm just thinking, well, if you're that far off on your cost base, kind of like Shay was saying, why aren't you, even though we've got this mature product out there, and theoretically it should be firm fixed price, if you can't achieve an objective position that you think is reasonable, then use that kind of as a thread or a club, or actually put it in use to get some, I guess, some movement in a negotiation. So it's at that point in time, theoretically, it should be firm fixed price. That part of the process, we know this requirement's fixed, but obviously something's broke if they're getting those kind of underruns. And then on the other side, as far as incentivizing performance and different things, we did some firm fixed price contracts where the requirement was maybe availability, and the requirement was 90%. That's what we had to have. There was some benefit for the government to have 95%. It wasn't the requirement, so we would set up a separate CLIN that was an incentive, and it was all quantitative. If they met these guidelines, this is how much of that additional money they could earn, so that they really did perform at a higher level, because you have your cost incentives on the FPIs and the CPIs, then you also had your incentive CLINs on just your regular contracts that really incentivized performance. And they worked out wonderful. The whole company, you saw that the employees started kind of self-policing themselves, because, again, one of the incentives was if there were security violations or whatnot, being in this classified environment. And it really became a whole contract workforce that had this mindset, because the contractor was sharing part of that incentive if they earned it with their employees. So their employees practiced that, hey, no, we got to be careful, we got to be diligent. And the contract benefited, the government benefited from that type of incentive. So they can be wonderful tools.
It's a great partnership for everybody. So this is a different question, a slight twist on things. Do you think that the government is capable of acting as a lead systems integrator on major development or operational programs?
I say yes. I do. I believe we can do anything we make up our minds to do. We just have to hire the right people, and then we have to give them the opportunity to do it. All too often, what we've seen is the moment somebody makes a mistake, somebody comes up with a regulation to fix the mistake. Has anybody kind of noticed that? The moment somebody went out, and I'm going to pick on my friends at GSA, and had a bad conference, all of us were bad. That's not the case. That's not the case, and that's not the way to correct the problem. Those who do something wrong, yes, they should be disciplined, whatever language you want to use, and they should be corrected. But don't apply it, don't cut us all with the same cloth. And I think we've discouraged, in some cases, the government taking the lead on things because we really don't believe they can do it because someone else failed out there. Let's talk about what are the recipes for success. It's about bringing the right people in. It's about empowering them to make smart choices and smart decisions. It's about giving them the tools and resources. And it's also about periodically making sure that we're checking in with them so we can course correct and not be afraid to course correct. And that's where leadership comes in. I think that all too often leaders step back sometimes, and we're not willing to stand up and say, look, we're going to make a mistake, guys. This is a high risk, and here are the things we can do to mitigate that risk. Oh, and by the way, if we mess it up, we'll march up there together to the hill and explain it to them and the GAOs and the IGs and everybody and their cousin. But get over it. So to me, I think we're just as smart, because a lot of the people that we bring into the government, by the way, you know where they come from? They come from out there, from industry. They come from all over. So, yes, I think we can do it. I think we should be encouraging more of that where feasible.
Cathy, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I think, a big part of one of the big things that we bring as a department and as a federal government to the table is the fact that we have a lot of different capabilities. And so I think some of the key to being able to integrate something large like that is just to make sure that we're leveraging the capabilities where it makes sense. And I think Soraya mentioned, making sure that we hire the right people and that we're doing the right things and that we're checking in. And some of that's also leveraging industry where it makes sense as well. And so really having that joint approach to how we solve a problem and how we manage a situation, I think, is the way to go.
And Jim, I take it you agree as well.
Kind of outside my area expertise,
Yeah.
but I'd have to say whether you could or couldn't, as a minimum, it should at least be more collaborative than it is. So.
Definitely. Also, and it's always a popular question with industry, how do your agencies view best value versus LPTA? It was already addressed to Shay.
So, I'm not a fan of LPTA unless, as Shay said, it's something where that technical quality is either known, you know what to expect from the industry, and so there's no distinguishing factors, and so it's okay to pay the lower price. But I am a huge believer in best value. When I think about the mission that I support and the people who will be using the products and services that I buy, especially the mission critical stuff, I think I want the very best possible products and services in their hands at the best prices that I can get, but definitely the very best. Quality becomes incrementally more important. So unfortunately, what I found is a lot of people use LPTA to do one thing and one thing only, and that's to avoid protest.
Right.
And I actually told Cathy this funny story that when I first became Chief Procurement Officer, somebody was presenting an acquisition strategy to me, and they said they were going to use LPTA. And when I said why, they said because it avoids protest. And I said, oh, well, yeah, hey, that's the way we should develop our strategies to avoid protest. My little secret to everybody is this. Don't worry about the protest. You're going to get it anyway because you don't control that. You control the winning or losing of that protest. You control the quality of your evaluation and how well you document. Those are the things we control. The decision to protest or not to protest, not in your hands, and you shouldn't lose a lot of sleep over it because you're probably going to get the protest anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that if they're truly from a customer requirement perspective, there's no differentiation, and as long as you meet this, and there's no way to go above this, and as long as you know no one's going to be below it, then I think that's where LPTA fits. But if there's any way to really truly differentiate, and the customer requirement would allow you to say, no, I would pay X amount more for this additional capability, then I think that's the direction we have to go.
I think that's the key, coming up with the differentiators. Jim, did you have experience with that at Hill?
Well, we kind of had something kind of in between where we do kind of like it wouldn't necessarily be, they could trade off. It wasn't a full trade off, but they could trade off for risk. So we would assess risk. So I mean, you could go with a lower price. I mean, a higher price if you had you felt there was substantial risk or whatnot. But personally, not a big fan on the work I did. It's always appropriate for certain situations of LPTAs because, I mean, it seems like people can go in and you hate to say it, but they can fool our evaluation teams to being technically acceptable, yet they don't have a clue what they're doing, and that's sometimes borne out in contract performance.
I think this question is getting to a concern that we use firm fixed price contracts more often than not because contractors and contracting officers are not knowledgeable on how FPIF, firm fixed price incentive firm target contracts, are set up and billed. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, I mean, I addressed this a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
I think that is absolutely the case, is that it's a contract type that we don't use a lot. And it is a little bit more complex and a little bit different. You really do need to truly have a common understanding of what that target should be. But I think that the more we train our folks to be able to do that and expose them to that, I think that it is a good tool to have in the toolbox where it fits. But I think that gets back to what Soraya was saying earlier is, you know, we have a tendency to say, okay, now everything needs to get everything's firm fixed price. Now everything should be FPIF. I think they're right. I think that there are a lot of different contract types for a reason, and that we need to leverage the ones that are most appropriate for that particular procurement.
Well said. I agree with everything you have to say.
It's just same with fixed LPTA versus best value. There's a time and place for everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think your acquisition strategy has to be based on what you know, what you're trying to buy, how complex that market is, and what the level of competition is that you're going to think you're going to get. You know, some people really like down select. Some people like voluntary down select versus, you know, what I call the hard down select, where, you know, you're out of here. As I like to call it.
Yeah.
So, but I think you pick your strategy according to what you know and what you understand and what you're trying to buy. And the same thing goes with the type of contracts. I do think we don't train the other types of contracts as well. I mean, I think we live in an IDIQ, TNM, firm fixed price world. We even do firm fixed price. We do TNM firm fixed price. We TNM it and then firm fixed price it. So everybody thinks it's a firm fixed price, right? So I think it's about training. It's about helping people understand. And I think it is sometimes about people like myself as the leader going, how in the world is that a firm fixed price? And I've done that a couple of times to people. I go, I don't look like a firm fixed price. So it's about asking the right questions and helping your team understand that it's okay to pick the right answer, even if that right answer isn't the popular answer of the day.
Well, I mean, I think that training goes on both sides, right? I think it's on the industry side as well as the government side. Because I can tell you that one of the things that we've encountered as we've tried to do more fixed price incentive types of contracts is there's not necessarily a clear understanding.
On the other side.
Right, on the other side of the table either. And I think sometimes the way the accounting systems work and things like that, it's not a clear path to get there. So you really have to be innovative in your approach to get to those different contract types sometimes and bend them a little bit to fit the contractors' accounting systems and things like that. So I think it's training both ways.
By the way, the other thing that we're seeing a lot more of, and I know that we try to do this a lot more, and I think you've probably seen this out there, hybrids. Don't lock yourself into just one contract time. You evolve over time. So maybe you start out, small on the fixed price incentive and start evolving over time on that. Because there is a fear factor. There is a fear factor that if I get it wrong, I'm going to get hauled up in front of everybody and their cousin to explain it. So.
Right. I mean, or maybe there's a part of the contract that can be firm fixed price, but then there's a portion where the risk really just doesn't take you there. So maybe within the contract itself, you have a couple of different approaches to parts of the work within the contract.
Exactly.
Mr. Saad mentioned earlier the cost deep dives. So in regard to cost deep dives, how important is it of having DCMA and DCA involved in those program-specific analysis for larger weapon system programs? Jim, did you experience
Well,
that?
I mean, everything he's seen is really big dollar stuff. I don't know about you guys. The majority of the folks I work with will never work on a major program like that. So on those, I think you've got to be hand in hand with DCMA and DCA. Most of those big programs, you're going to be with big contractors that have in-resident people that sit in the plants and actually know that stuff, and you've got to use them. You'd be a fool not to. On smaller stuff, I guess you'll involve them as applicable. I mean, if they're not familiar with a contractor, but you've got confidence in that person as a DCMA analyst, that he's good and his skills, invite him along. You can always use another smart head in the room on your side of the table. So, I think it's important. I wouldn't say you need to have them along just because you have to have them along. You have them along if they can provide value to you. But we didn't do major acquisitions there in the hundreds of billions and stuff like that. But I guess what I'd like to point out is just as important is I don't know how many people here will do those acquisitions, but if every one of you guys, I guess didn't do your jobs and had 4 actions a year that you overpriced by $1 million, we're talking about $1 billion+ a year right here. So it's important at all levels that we do our job. So. Even though your work doesn't seem as big and you're not going to have as many assets to throw at it, the cumulative effect is every bit as important as the work they're putting in on these great big gigs.
And how do you deal with that at DHS without a DCMA and DCA?
So first of all, I have some pricing experts on staff, but also we do reach out to DCMA and DCAA whenever we need to, as appropriate. But we also have private contractors. We've actually negotiated contracts where we can leverage private auditing firms that can come in and help us with these deep dives, firms that are experts in doing this kind of stuff. Because the idea is just bring the experts in so you can get through that process as quickly as possible and get the information you want. All too often, sometimes we jump into these discussions and we don't really know what we want. Shay actually said that. Make sure you know you're asking for the right thing, and don't ask crazy questions because you'll get crazy answers, right? And then you got to do something with it. So we try to rely on the expertise. But when we went through that dry spell for 1 year where we didn't have DCAA, we had already started negotiating our own contracts so that we can move at a faster pace. But I certainly believe that you leverage the resources that you have available. So we talk about DCA and DCMA. There are other agencies out there that also have knowledge. Let us not forget that. When you're dealing with labs, for example, Department of Energy probably has some of the best labs, and they've negotiated some of the best contracts with labs. Why not go use those guys? So that's what I think we need to do, is leverage all of the expertise that we have across the government.
So another question from the crowd is, can you address your thoughts on certification and qualification? Is the value equation flowed?
Is the value equation
flowed? Maybe they meant followed. I don't know.
Flawed.
So here's what I would say. This is going to come out ugly, but I only know how to say it the way I think it. I've met a lot of certified, educated folks that I would not trust to negotiate $1 million deal. And I've read a lot of folks who do not have certification, who do not have college degrees, who I would sit at the table at any time against any company because they're sharp, they're quick-witted, they know what they're doing. it is important to be certified. Don't take that lightly. I think it is important to get that certification. It is important to get that education and that training. But then it's important to use your thinking skills. It's not just credentials. Credentials do not get the deal cut for you. And so I think it's important that we balance that and that we make sure that we're providing that on-the-job training, that ability to exercise that training, because, you know, like I said, I've met people with slews of certifications that couldn't negotiate a $1 million deal, and I think that that's important. So I do think that the process, I wouldn't say the process is flawed, I'm just not sure that we're always paying attention to how we're applying that.
Would you discuss the appropriateness of using firm fixed price contracts for repair? So again, a question on when's the right time and place for contract.
So I think from a repair perspective, we do use, so from a DLA perspective, we have responsibility for the procurement of new depot level reparables. So the new reparables themselves and the services actually buy the repair, but we do dabble in that a little bit, so I'm somewhat familiar. We do firm fixed price that sometimes, and I think where we have a good baseline, a good basis of estimate that we understand that what it should cost, right? Then I think that we absolutely can negotiate firm fixed price for repair. I think where sometimes we run into challenges is if there are a lot of unknowns, and we recently had a situation with some engine or some components that we had offloaded where there was some variability in the type of components that needed to be repaired. So the scrap rates were significantly different than what we thought we were going to need to be. We happened to be in a sole source environment. We went back in, renegotiated, put in some provisions that allowed for some different scrap rates based on the type of components that we had. So I think that really gets to the flexibility, and we realized there was a problem, that the firm fixed price wasn't working, and that we needed to do something that worked for both of us. Exactly. So I think it can be done. But.
And what's your experience with that? I know DHS has that challenge as well.
Yeah. So I think a lot of it has to do with what Cathy said. You got to know what you're repairing. You have to have some history, some historical knowledge. You got to collect information to really understand what it takes to do that, and to really understand how the industry approaches it. Because a lot of times we'll go out and say we want to fix price it, and industry will tell you that's not something we would ever fix price in the real world, or vice versa. We don't fix price it. We go time and materials, and industries like, this is how we do it all the time, and this is the way we would sell it to one another. So I really think it is about understanding the particular product or equipment that you're trying to repair, and what history do you have on it, what do you know about that equipment, and what do you know about what it takes to repair. Also having the knowledge to know when it's not cost effective to repair.
Right.
And I think that's the bigger challenge that we all face in government, trying to make things last longer than they should.
Right. I would agree.
So Soraya, you created a lot of interest in your innovation programs, and you suggested rewards for failure, and you touched upon this already, and it's viewed as a great concept. So like I said, there's a lot of excitement out from the audience on that. How do you instill that in leadership and the acquisition professionals? And I think I'm curious too, in terms of, you're obviously providing the top level leadership and support, and the workforce is energized. How are you hitting that mid-level management who might have their own fear factor involved?
Sure. So first of all, it's about communication. It's easy to stand up and say, I'm going to support you. And then, you know, we've seen many leaders do that, and then they go duck for cover. I don't, obviously, since I've been like very public about Flash. But it is about communication. So one of the things that I did as the Chief Procurement Officer that I started last year is twice a year I hold a procurement town hall where I talk to the entire procurement community. We actually go on a webinar. I have the HCAs there with me, the heads of contracting with me, so that we speak as a leadership team to our community, so that they're hearing us talking about it's okay to try new things, to try different things. And we give the community an opportunity to ask us questions. The second thing that we've done is through the Procurement Innovation Lab, we do two things. One, we call it testing. The guy who runs my innovation lab always explains this way better than I do. But anyway, we run the testing piece, which is where you're practicing the innovation. And then we run the learning piece, where we share that information and knowledge. On the procurements themselves, whoever worked it gets to teach it. So we actually invite the folks who ran the successful procurement, people that are just like the folks that are thinking about experimenting out there, and sometimes even their supervisors, to actually run a webinar, typically no more than 2 hours, where they explain what that innovation was, what went well, what didn't, what they would have done differently, what they liked about it or didn't like about it. About a month and a half ago, I hosted a webinar along with the Acting Undersecretary for Management where we talked about innovation, and we talked about the price of innovation. And the price of innovation is that sometimes you are going to fail, or as Soraya likes to say, you're going to stub your toe. Sometimes you might even break your foot. Okay, it happens, right? But it's okay. We as leaders have a responsibility. All of us at every level of leadership have a responsibility of understanding the difference between failure because you were trying to do something new or different or unusual versus performance failure, where you just weren't doing your job. And distinguishing that, recognizing it, and talking about it, and explaining it to people, and rewarding people who do take chances, who do take risks, is how you incentivize others. We actually did that survey that I talked about at the beginning. So we did that survey again, and the numbers have now shifted. About 40% of the people said they feel a little bit more comfortable at DHS trying something new. They believe their leadership will support them. That's a huge difference from 70%, I'm not going there because nobody's going to back me. That's really important. It is really important to give people an opportunity. And everything doesn't have to be big and showy is the other thing I tell people. You know, every innovation doesn't have to be huge. It can be very small because small sometimes makes a difference.
So I have some great closing questions. I'll go through both of them, and you can choose which one you want to answer in our time remaining. So from a big picture, how do we collectively, between the government and industry, build an environment where there's real trust, especially in pricing contracts? If you could be king or queen for the day, and some of you are, what major change would you implement in terms of pricing?
So I guess I'll start. So I think from a collaboration perspective, and how do we really increase the collaboration between industry and the government? I think one of the big things that we need to make sure that we do is, and we talked about them this morning, right, is make sure that we're clear on what it is that our requirement is. Make sure that we're sharing what our assumptions are back and forth, keeping the lines of communication open. So rather than me just throwing something across the fence to you and saying, I need all of these things, me really saying, hey, based on what you've given me, I can't get to point B, and this is where I really need to be. What information do you have to help me get there, right? So really, truly creating that dialogue and understanding what is it that I'm trying to get to, and then allowing industry to help me understand, what they can provide to get there, and vice versa. So I think that really opening those lines of communication, and I think what Shay said this morning, making sure that you have people who you can, no kidding, trust at the table, and know that, that's true on both sides, right? Creating that environment of trust. So I think that's really one of the big things, is being transparent with each other and opening those lines of communication.
I agree.
So I will second what Cathy said. It is about building that trust, building those relationships, really talking to industry as honestly and as openly as we can about what we're trying to achieve and how do we get there. And I think that conversation has to start early. It has to occur often. We can't be afraid to, quote unquote, open the kimono and have those honest dialogues with industry. And I do think that, yes, we have to maintain that relationship, that professional relationship that's out there, but that doesn't mean that we can't collaborate, that we can't share ideas, and that we can't learn from them. We've often brought industry in to talk about some of their own failures. And believe you me, one-on-one, they will share information. They're not going to talk in a room full of people, but they're going to come in one-on-one and share with you where they had a cloud implementation failure, or they improperly priced something and they took a bath on it, or worse, where they ripped off the government. I've actually had companies talk about that. So I think that that is important. And if I were queen for a day, what I would say is to change the landscape of pricing, you got to change the landscape of procurement, because it's not pricing in and of itself. It's that whole slew of regulations surrounding us that's impacting our ability to do good pricing. Whether it's the contract type, whether it's defining the requirement, how well we define that requirement, how well we engage with industry, it's all those factors that impact pricing. So I think it's about bringing the community together more often to make sure that we all understand each other's roles and how we impact each other's roles so that we can do a better job collectively.
And Jim?
Talking to industry and listening to industry. I mean, if you have all these RFIs prior to source selection and all the contractors are giving you all this great input, yet they see the solicitation and it's the same old solicitation they saw 5 years ago, then they're going to stop sharing with you. Be like, it's falling on deaf ears. everybody happy all the time. We're going to have to listen to what they say and say, yeah, that makes sense. And I've heard it from 4 different offers, so that's probably something we should be doing that we're not currently doing. So I think you listen, and then when they see it implemented into requirements coming back out, and that relationship will build even more, that the government's, they're happy with what we're doing. Hey, my girlfriend's here. Did she come out? But I mean, that's about it. I think I said, just echo what they said. I mean, as far as trusting industry, that's going to be a case-by-case basis, because, I've done over 1,000 buys, and I've come across some slimy people. And I mean, and I don't want to say that company was that way, that individual was that way, and I wouldn't have trusted anything he said. He could tell me the sun was going to rise in the east, and I'd say, no, you're a liar, because everything else out of your mouth has been a lie as well. So that's something you're going to develop with individuals as you work with them. If you work with the same contractor over and over again, you'll develop those relationships of trust. And they'll see that when they've given you good data, and you said, yep, that supports your position, I acknowledge it, and you make a change, they'll be receptive the same way. So I'd say that's not something you can say, I blindly trust industry. No. You're going to build that up with each individual company and contracting officer from the other side that you work with. So would be my thoughts.
And I think from my perspective, the key words are fair and reasonable.
Right.
So it's not, as Shay said, bringing people to their knees, but it's really being fair and reasonable. So we have mutual success.
Exactly.
So I want to thank the panel for their time. I think we all found this interesting, being able to ask you questions and then the interplay between you as you were answering the question and touching upon what each other said. I think that was great. So please join me in thanking the panel for their time and their efforts.
Thank you.